Welcome to the Working on Wellbeing podcast by the World Wellbeing Movement, the podcast that allows you to be a fly on the wall during conversations with the world's leading wellbeing experts. I'm your host, Sarah Cunningham, and today I'm joined by a distinguished sports psychologist whose incredible work on mental performance and mental preparation in sport played a pivotal role in the success of Team GB in last year's Paris Olympics. But before I welcome today's guest, I just want to take a moment to thank our series sponsor, S&P Global. S&P Global provide the world's leading organisations with the essential intelligence they need to make confident decisions. S&P Global, powering global markets. Now, I couldn't be more excited to welcome today's guest, Jess Thom. Jess is head psychologist for the Team GB Olympic team, who of course performed incredibly well at last year's Paris Olympics. She's also worked with a number of professional football teams, and she has her own background as a high-level athlete, having been both a professional figure skater and I believe a freestyle skier. And more recently, she's founded her own organisation, MindForPerformance, where she takes those lessons and insights from sports psychology and uses them to help people both in and out of sport with improving their mental resilience and mental well-being. So, Jess, you are so welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. Looking forward to it.
Oh, we're looking forward to it too. We're absolutely delighted to have you here. And you know, as I researched all of the incredible work you've done, I thought, wow, what successes you've had, going from your own successes as an athlete to becoming the head psychologist for Team GB, to also founding your own company, MindForPerformance. But I'm really interested in where it all began. Was there a moment where you decided that you wanted to dedicate your career to working on well-being and particularly to becoming a sports psychologist?
Yeah, I would love to say that there was a really thought through process to it, but I think I've always had a fascination in people. So I decided that for my undergraduate degree, I wanted to study psychology. So that's sort of where the psychology side of things really began. But originally, I thought I would become a forensic psychologist. I thought that would be really interesting. And that was the path that I wanted to go down. I started to explore the training route that would involve, and actually realized it was going to be quite a long process, sort of 6 years, probably wouldn't earn that much money. So I thought, you know what, now I'm not going to go do that. I'll go do a couple of ski seasons for a few years. And I did that and then realized I couldn't be a ski bum for my entire life. So I thought, right, I need to find some sort of career. And I thought, well, I did enjoy psychology. So why don't I combine the two? I'll do sports psychology. And then, you know, that's better than an office job, but interest in psychology, and then combining with my interest in sport, having, you know, been an athlete myself. So it just sort of came about through that way. And then 7.5 years it took me to train, and longer than forensic psych, and probably earned less than a forensic psych. But yeah, it's definitely not a decision that I regret in the slightest. I love what I do now. So yeah.
Wow. And what is that study journey? What was the 7.5 years of sort of study to train?
Yeah, so there are different routes that you can take now, but when I was doing my training, there was only one route really. So you would have to do your undergraduate degree in straight psychology then, and then you do a master's in sports psychology, and then you do stage 2 training, it's called, through the British Psychological Society. And the shortest that you could do that in would be sort of 2.5, 3 years, but most people it takes a bit longer. So I can't remember, it took me 3.5, 4.5 years, something like that, to complete that 3.5 years. And that's on the job training, getting your hours in different competencies to show that you're qualified enough to do the job as a psychologist.
Wow. I'm really interested in the fact that you have your own background, of course, at a very high level in athletes. So if I'm right, were you a professional figure skater and a very high level freestyle skier? Is that right?
Yeah, I was probably not a professional figure skater. I was a very serious figure skater when I was younger and competed at international level. But I retired from that about 18 and moved more into freestyle skiing and tried to make it there. But I think I was probably too old at the time, still only in my 20s, but too old for that game. But competed again, sort of international competitions and not extremely high level, but um, at that point there weren't many women in the sport either. So um, it was just sort of taking off. And nowadays you see well, that was funny at the Beijing Winter Games. Some of those female Olympians were the girls that I was competing against, and they were literally girls. They were sort of 13, 14 years old when they were competing against me. But it was nice to see them actually at the games. So yeah, my own experiences of an athlete definitely shaped my career choice. And I think, I look back at, especially when I was a figure skater, because that's a hard sport. You spend a long time on the ice and you're by yourself for a lot of it. And you're doing stuff that could really hurt you if it goes wrong. So logically, your brain's going, don't do this, you're going to fall and hurt yourself. So I had a lot of like mental blocks going into certain jumps. And I think that if I'd had a sports psychologist, I would have met my full potential, I think, in the sport. And I think that having those experiences probably pushed me towards the sports psychology route more so than I realized at the time.
I think it's really interesting that you're talking about how young people are when they get into high level elite sports. If you could go back in time and if you could give your younger self advice, maybe age 14, 15, 16, what advice would you give to your younger self?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I would probably say that it's normal to be finding this really difficult and therefore ask for help and get support because there is loads of help out there and there are people that can help you through what is a very normal, difficult thing that you're experiencing, but you're not on your own and having to figure that out. And sometimes I think athletes and people feel like they need to figure it out by themselves and it's weak to ask for help. But actually, no, asking for help is a strength. And when you do that, the weight is lifted and you can change how you view things and meet your full potential.
And I have to say, I think that's great advice, no matter what age you are. It's okay to ask for help. It's not a sign of weakness to ask for help in any area in life. So I want to hop back in the time machine and I want to go forward in time a little bit more. What led you to your role as the Team GB head psychologist or lead psychologist? Because, I mean, you've provided psychological support to literally some of the most accomplished athletes on the planet. How did you get into that role?
Yeah, so I started my career off in professional sport, and then I got a job within one of the Olympic sports. I think it was 2018, something like that. Um, and sort of that was my first, oh no, it was before that actually. I joined 2017 in bobsleigh. That was my first Olympic sport. And that sort of just opened the door for me into that world of the Olympics. And it's a very different way of operating and working compared to professional sports. So I just learned that environment, that context, and did what I do best of just delivering good psychological support. And athletes, staff, systems benefited from that. So the Tokyo Olympics came along and I was desperate to get there one way or another. And I wasn't due to be going until COVID hit. And then because of all the COVID restrictions, they needed some extra support to manage the COVID situation on the ground. And they wanted a psychologist who could do that. And so I had interviewed for the head psych role at that for that Team GB Tokyo Games. and didn't get it, but they offered me this role instead because of COVID. So that's kind of then how I got into the more of the Team GB specific stuff. So that was really helpful because then I could understand what it's like in that games environment, and a very privileged position of being in the front seat basically through that games. And I did a similar role then in the Beijing Winter Games, COVID support, but also delivering sports psychology. It was more of a hybrid role. So then when it came round to interviewing for the Paris role, I had quite a lot of experience of an Olympic Games, but also like a strong understanding of the world of sports psychology. So I was successful, which was brilliant, and definitely a career goal ticked off there.
But it does just show that there's, rarely such a thing as overnight success. So there were various stepping stones on your way to this incredible role.
Completely. And, I think that what really helped me is I put myself forward for that position for Tokyo, probably knowing I was never going to get it, but doing that is what allowed me to actually get it later down the line. So I always say to people, just go for it, because you don't know what will happen, and don't put limits on yourself. You've got to put yourself out there to get that lucky break, which probably isn't luck, but maybe a little bit of luck as well.
I think it's actually really important advice. We get a lot of listeners to this podcast in sort of maybe the corporate world. And there was some research done a few years ago at this stage, but it indicated that on average, a man is likely to apply for a job if they tick, maybe, I can't remember what the exact percentage was. I'm going to get my statistics wrong here, but whatever, sort of, I don't know, half of the criteria. But a woman needs to feel that they tick nearly everything in that criteria list. And for a lot of jobs now, because the world of work is changing, there's actually never an ideal candidate. There's never somebody who ticks every single box. So the advice that you're giving, even if you think, do you know what, I'm not quite fully qualified, put your hat in the ring. You might go in at maybe a slightly lower job than you expected, but it's your stepping stone to the dream job you wanted.
Completely. You have to try.
Brilliant. And to be honest, that is a bit of a high pressure situation, but not in comparison to what athletes face. So, I love watching the Olympics, and I don't have a background in sport. I'm in awe, but I always look at people, and the older I get, the younger these incredible athletes seem, in the most high pressure stakes you could imagine on the world stage. What do you do to support an athlete in that moment? I mean, Tokyo, Paris, absolutely. You've maybe a runner, you've 10 seconds, make or break. So high pressured. How do you support them in that moment?
Yeah, I mean, there is hours and hours, years and years of work that goes into being able to manage those 10 seconds. And that's what you don't see at the Olympics, is the hard work that goes into it. So from a psychological point of view, we have, now we have a 4-year period. Before Paris, it was a 3-year period to help individuals find the skills that help them to manage themselves on the day. And I always come from a place of you can't fight the thoughts and feelings that you have. They're normal, and actually teaching athletes to accept them and notice them and drop the struggle with them, but instead put their energy into focusing on the key behaviors that they want to demonstrate on that day. So an athlete going into their event, being really clear on what success looks like for them. So if I do this, this, and this, I will go and I will perform at my best. And once you get that clarity, you can start to then recognize some of the hooks, as we call them, the thoughts and the feelings and the memories that might try and pull you away from being at your best. And once you know your hooks, and when you can notice when they start to show up, then you can start to use some of the psychological skills to unhook, basically, and create distance so that you can choose your response, which is in line with, this is me at my best. So that's the process. It sounds really simple, but what we're doing throughout that 3-4 year period is testing it under other high pressure situations, other big events, and refining it and doing things like pressure training. And then, so by the time they get to the games, they've got belief in that mental process that they have, so that they know, okay, I just need to do this. And I expect myself to have thoughts about freaking out over the fact that I'm at Olympic Games with 40,000 people watching me in a stadium, plus everyone on television. So yeah, it's a long process of testing, refining, but unless you are really clear on your strategies and your idea of what you want to do, how you want to show up, you won't manage that pressure. Or you might, but it would be fluke, I think.
Well, let's talk about some of those strategies and some of those psychological skills. One of my personal favourite episodes of the podcast so far was with Professor Ethan Kross. I'm sure you're familiar with his work. He wrote the book Chatter, which is full of tools and tips for how we can harness our inner voice and sort of minimise that negative chatter or the negative inner voice and harness it for positive. But I believe that you also have very specific tools and tips that you use to help athletes minimize their negative inner talk. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, so like I sort of touched on earlier, I come from the school of thought that you can't fully control the things that your brain is going to be talking about, thinking about, feeling. So that's the foundation that I start from. Don't think that you can control your thinking and control your feeling, because you actually can't. And if I had a penny for every athlete that said to me, I just need to not think and I'll be fine, I'd be a very rich lady. But to date, I've yet to find anyone who can just stop thinking. So instead, we take the approach of going, well, what are the types of thoughts that do typically show up? And how are they impacting you at the moment? And what we start to see is that there's certain like types of thoughts that show up all the time. The sort of like, I'm not good enough, for example. And actually, one of the things I talk to clients and athletes about is giving it a sort of name. So you can either say, okay, that's Frank again. My imposter syndrome is Frank. So that's Frank. Please, thanks, Frank, but that's not helpful right now. And it just takes the power out of it. Or giving it sort of calling it a story, so they can say, oh, that's my I'm not good enough story again. So it just sort of finding strategies like that, you know, create a bit of distance between your thoughts and help you see that you are not your thoughts, but not trying to waste energy stopping thinking and yes, having no thoughts, or only thinking positive thoughts. That's also not that helpful. One of the other things that self-talk is very important in sport. So you can't control all of your thoughts, but at the same time, you can choose how you talk to yourself. So I have an athlete who talks to themselves in like a headspace voice. So if anyone's used that app, you know, the mindfulness talking app. So they will be saying to themselves, oh, that was really frustrating shot, but in a way that isn't aggressive and angry like it would have been previously. So again, it just changing the impact that thought has on the individual. So yeah, I'm not sure I've explained that very well. I've gone here, there, and everywhere with it.
No, I mean, I think you've explained it really well, actually. And it's really helpful, because one of the things I always hope for with this podcast is that listeners take away, you know, one or two tips that they can put into practice in their everyday life. And another guest we had actually on season 1 was Niall Breslin. And Niall, famously, when he was suffering from quite severe panic attacks, he gave a name to his inner critic, and that was Jeffrey. I think it was Jeffrey. But I think that's quite interesting, personalising that. And the other thing that Ethan Kross recommended was talk to yourself as you might talk to a friend. And so, you know, I get nervous before a podcast interview, and I would actually do that trick. I would actually say to myself in my head, Sarah, you can do this. But of course, one thing that athletes face, possibly more than most of us in everyday life, but we all face it, is setbacks. So an athlete could train for 4 years and get an injury. They might, you know, have a bad day. You know, in fact, if I'm correct, I think in the Paris Olympics, Adam Peaty ended up getting COVID, and I think, if I'm right, he came third when possibly, had he been in top form, he might have been a contender for first place, having obviously a number of goals to his name before that. How do you support athletes if they face a setback and maybe they have another competition in 48 hours? How do you get them back to that positive mind frame in such a short space of time?
Yeah, it's a really challenging one, and I think there's lots of different things. So first of all, they need somewhere to process all the emotion. So it's a safe space for them to have a rant and a rave and a cry, or whatever it is that they need, just to get the emotion out, and start to process it. But I think that you know, I always come from the approach that with every setback, there's always an opportunity. And so there is always a silver lining for that really bad thing that has happened. And we need to find that silver lining, because with that, that's something probably that you can take action from. So an example, a rugby player who had a really bad shoulder injury for the second time is going to be out for at least 6+ months. And actually, the silver lining there is that, one, he can actually train his lower body much better. So he wouldn't be able to load his legs normally because he'd be doing rugby training. So that's the opportunity for him there. And two, he can spend some more time with his family. So it's finding actually what is the silver lining, and doing both of those things will actually help him in his career and him as an individual, for his own well-being and mental health. So I always sort of try and take that approach with an athlete when they are ready. When it comes to competition time, and like the Adam Peaty, for example, with an athlete, you would do a lot of planning around, like, what if certain things happen. So you would plan for, actually, what if I don't win a medal in my first event? What if I do win a medal in my first event? How do I want to respond in that 24, 48 hours afterwards? So you're not leaving anything to chance. And therefore, when that happens, I know what an athlete needs to hear and I know what an athlete needs to do, but they do as well. My job is just to help remind them of that when they're in that, highly emotive state. I'm the calm voice that comes in and says, remember, we planned for this. This is what you need to go do now. And it's much smoother than you would think. Of course, there are times where unexpected things happen and you just have to work through it as best you can. But, you have to have the space to allow for that upset and devastation sometimes as well, which is the hard bit, the really harsh bit of sport.
I mean, it really, really is. Obviously, things have changed a lot in probably as little as the past 10 years, but certainly the past 20 years. Today, what's the balance for athletes in terms of the balance between mental preparation and physical preparation?
Oof, that's a really hard one. I think it would also depend on the sport. But I don't see them as two separate things per se, because even when you're in the gym, for example, you can use psychological skills to help you in that gym session. So I don't see it as black and white, as like, this is physical training, this is psychological training. But I do think that there is more of an emphasis in all sports, really, professional and Olympic, on the importance of putting time and energy into your mental training. And, it's very common to have a sports psychologist in an Olympic team, and it's more so, or it's on the increase, I should say, within the professional sports world as well. So, yeah, no black and white answer there, but you're always doing mental training. Maybe I should say that.
And perhaps in life we should be as well, because many of our listeners, like myself, will certainly not be professional athletes, but we face many similar challenges. There are many metaphors in life. And I know that you have also founded MindForPerformance. And correct me here, my understanding is that you're taking all of the psychological tools that you've learned and your experience as well supporting professional athletes, but your organisation actually offers support to potentially anybody. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So we do a lot of work within the corporate space, businesses, but in the past have worked with schools, also have some individuals that I support, non-athletes. And essentially, I work in that space of performing and performance psychology. And just because you're not on an Olympic stage doesn't mean you have to go and deliver your best and deal with high pressure situations and essentially perform. So the strategies that we teach are very applicable. And I think that, the world of psychology has moved on from just working with problems or mental ill health. And actually, the world of sports psychology can offer so much in that positive mental health space and actually allowing individuals to thrive and flourish. So there's a real demand for those skills. And I think that it helps individuals knowing, well, if Olympians use this, it's probably going to be good. So maybe I'll give it a go. So it just gives us a bit of that validity behind the methods and the techniques that we teach individuals.
For sure. And, one of the things that all of us face, some to a higher degree than others, is anxiety or nerves before a big event. So whereas for an athlete, that might be before they, go out on the pitch. Day to day, it might be before an important client meeting, an important presentation, maybe a job interview. What's your advice to anybody listening who maybe becomes overwhelmed with anxiety or nerves before a big event?
Yeah. I would first of all start off by saying that is completely normal. And, I've been working in this space for years and years and years, and I still get nervous. And so it's a really normal response for your body to have. But I also know that sometimes it's not necessarily anxiety. It can just be anticipation and, excitement, for example, and your physiological response to anxiety is the same as excitement. So actually, can you change your relationship with that feeling? And instead of going, oh my God, I'm really anxious, I can't do this, you can go, right, I've got this feeling in my stomach that tells me I'm about to go do something really important. And actually, I'm excited to go see what I can do. But I also recognize I'm a little bit anxious that something bad could happen. That's okay. So sort of change that relationship with the feeling of expect it and see it as a helpful thing in some ways. But then the other bit of it, same as what we do with athletes, is being really clear on, okay, so what do I want to do in this meeting that I have, in this presentation? How do I want to come across? What are the key things that I want to think about? What do I want to portray in terms of my body language? Being really clear on those behaviors and rehearsing them. There's no harm with practicing a presentation, for example, or the first 5 minutes of a job interview, so that when you come to do it, it feels a little bit more like, oh yeah, I've done this before, I can do this again now. But if you don't start to think about the markers and the behaviors of success for you, it's quite hard to not get overwhelmed by that emotion in the moment.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of incredible advice there. I love the reframing piece, reframing those feelings as excitement. So you're still feeling the same feelings, but you've given them a positive framing. And also, I couldn't agree more on practice. So we all know that Olympians have practiced for years and years and years and years, but we somehow expect ourselves to be able to go out on stage and deliver a 20-minute presentation without much practice. I think it is really important to note that practice is such an important part of what we do. But for some people, anxiety isn't just an occasional experience. It isn't just something that arises before a big event. Some people are feeling anxiety on an ongoing basis, and maybe they're in that always on state. We talk about flight or fight. They're sort of in that state all the time. What's your advice to somebody who might be listening, who's feeling that constant state of anxiety?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm not a clinical psychologist, so I wouldn't work in the sort of space of chronic anxiety, for example. But, my first thing would be to say, go and speak to someone who can help you manage those things, because you don't have to suffer in silence. But I also know that anxiety is really difficult because you're worried about what will happen. You therefore avoid sometimes doing the things that are good to help with that anxiety. So for example, I think exercise is a brilliant tool to help manage any sort of tough feeling that you might be having, anxiety being a prime example, but that anxiety can stop you. So again, if you go from the place of, okay, I know that I'm going to feel anxious and I'm going to find a way of exercising, as opposed to I'm anxious, therefore I can't go out and exercise. So it's sort of there's a change in that mindset, I think, around it. But I also think there's other things that you can do on a daily basis, just having a slight pause where you just, start to regulate your nervous system. So mindfulness is brilliant for that. And there's loads of research that supports that. So, get yourself an app and sit and do some mindful activities for 5 minutes, or even if it's a mindfulness coloring book. These are all really, really helpful. Breathing exercises, another really simple tool that can help sort of regulate and reduce anxiety a bit. But I think, to be honest, one of the really important things to add into there is be really clear on your values and what is important to you. And I think that when you're clear on your values, it makes it easier to guide your behavior. So getting clarity on those will then help you shape, okay, what do I want to do? What don't I want to do? And that's irrespective of the anxiety and the feeling. And actually, when you start living your life in line with your values, I think what tends to happen is that anxiety slowly reduces over time, because you have that sense of purpose and satisfaction in what you're doing on a daily basis.
Jess, thank you so much. There was a huge amount of really helpful information in there. And I would reiterate, for anybody who really is sort of struggling, I always say do seek that professional support. I benefited myself, and I've talked publicly about this before, but I suffered from quite severe panic attacks in my early 20s. And I benefited hugely from that professional support and all of the other tools you're talking about as well, which I was in some ways taught through that. And I might, if you don't mind, just share one which has helped me. There was a lady called, a psychotherapist called Dr. Anya Tubridy, who helped me when I was suffering from panic attacks. And she wrote a book called When Panic Attacks. Sadly, she's no longer with us. But she talks about in that book, I think it's Don't Think About Polar Bears. Now, it might not have been polar bears, but if I say to you, don't think about polar bears, you're probably going to picture a polar bear. And of course, this is happening to us when we get into the state of anxiety. We start thinking, how do I stop the anxiety? And all we're thinking about is polar bears, if anxiety is our polar bear metaphor. And that's where the visualization, the mindfulness, tuning into the present is trying to stop us fixating on the polar bears, stop us fixating on the anxiety. And for anybody who does struggle, the emergency 54321, which I'm sure you're really familiar with, is so helpful to tune into the present moment. So, what are 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can taste. What am I missing, Jess? I'm missing one of the sentences. Smell. Yes, smell is in there. Yeah. But I've certainly found that really helpful. But, as you say, professional support is always the number one tip.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think there's a really important challenge that we all face now, athletes in particular, that perhaps they didn't face 20 years ago. One of those challenges is fame. The other challenge is instant fame and social media. So now for an athlete, nobody might know who they are, and overnight the entire world knows who they are. Social media, double-edged sword, but obviously it comes with critique. How do you support your athletes in managing their relationship with social media and also in some ways navigating that instant fame?
Yeah, it's really difficult, and actually, one of the other challenges is winning a medal and then not having instant fame, because there's an expectation that suddenly this medal is going to change my life for the better, and that's not the case. So it's both ways, really, actually. But I'm not sure I've got this perfectly nailed, to be honest with you. But with I find the social media slightly easier in some ways to navigate because it's something that we deal with all the time for every single athlete. But I think that I would speak to athletes about actually what's helpful and what's not helpful in that social media. And if it's not helpful, try and cut it out, find a way of not, just don't engage in it. But if you are going to engage in it, you need to set a time limit, because you can get caught doom scrolling and, you know, go down that rabbit hole of finding everyone who said anything bad about you. We often, for major events like the Olympic Games, suggest actually just coming off social media for the entirety of those 2 weeks that you're there. But of course, like, the challenge is that they have to use social media to capitalize on those successes that they've had to get the fame to then earn the money, because Olympians do not earn a lot of money from just doing their sport. So it's that's the balance that I find really difficult to help athletes with. But what I always encourage them to do is, through all of it, is to keep perspective. So because someone is saying something nasty about you, one, it doesn't mean that that's true. And actually, can you think about whose opinion does matter to you? Focus on that. And if someone says something nasty, there's probably something going on for them in that, and it's more about them than it is about you. So helping them keep that perspective, I think, is quite helpful. And I think the same thing comes to that the fame aspect. You've got to keep that perspective and stay grounded, and you know, seek the support and the advice and the opinions of the people who you trust and you care about, and you know, live in a way that is in line with what matters to you and their feedback on that, not every single person and their dog who's giving you an opinion right now. And it's helping them navigate who's really important, who's not important, what is important to you, what's not important to you. But I'd be lying if I've said I've got that spot on, to be honest. I think it's an evolving piece of thinking of how to support social media and fame.
Again, fascinating. And again, not something that's limited to athletes. So perhaps athletes face a lot more public scrutiny and fame, which hopefully most of us don't have to deal with the challenges of fame. But there's always public scrutiny, and we're all navigating social media. So what are your tips, pieces of advice for anybody listening, no matter what field they're in, to navigate the challenges of social media?
Definitely set a time limit. That's what I've done, and it's really helped me. So it's really simple, just 20 minutes a day, and that's enough. And you know, be really selective on the accounts that you're choosing to follow. And if there's an account that is constantly making you really angry or upset, then just don't follow it. You have a choice in that respect of what you do choose and, you know, follow and like and all that kind of thing. So be selective, but also, you know, I think that each individual has a responsibility in themselves in terms of what they are putting out there on social media. And I would say that if it's not something that you would either want to say directly to someone or like someone to know that you're the person who wrote that, then don't write it. It's as simple as that. And I think we owe each other the courtesy of just behaving like appropriate humans online. And it's too easy, isn't it, to hide behind a keyboard and write a comment, but actually to pause and think about, how might that be impacting someone else? And would I say that to them directly? If I wouldn't, then why am I doing it now?
If I can echo back the word that sprung to mind as you were talking, it's kindness. We need to treat each other with kindness. The research shows, and actually we had Dr. Kelly Harding on a previous episode who talked about the fact that when we treat each other with kindness, that improves not only our mental health, but our physical health as well. And there's a lot of research that shows this. But if we're bringing kindness into our in-person interactions, we need to bring that same kindness into our virtual interactions.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's a really nice way of putting it.
Yeah. Well, something that I think all of our listeners are going to want to know is how you look after your own well-being? Because and let's talk about when you're actually in Paris, when you were at the Olympics last year. You know, you are tasked with looking after the well-being of, again, some of the best athletes in the world. You're probably very busy. How do you look after your own well-being?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and one that I've definitely got better at over the years. Struggled with this as a young psychologist, not to take all my work home and to switch off from it. So the games is a good example. Actually, it's 5 weeks that we're away for, and they're long days. So I've learned to it's really basic: eat when you can and sleep when you can, first and foremost, because you think, oh, I'll get lunch in an hour or so, but something will come up. If you've got the time now, just go and do it now. So basics like that. But also, I have a lot of support from colleagues, and I have supervision, and I have other friends and psychologists that I can call up when I need a bit of extra TLC myself or a bit of perspective. And that's a really important sort of support network that I think I've learned to rely on more and more. But the other thing that I do is I try and plan for my own self-care. So I think about, actually, in this busy week that I've got coming up, where can I fit in times that are just for me to do something for me? And I do try and take time off, and I take good holidays and things like that to ensure that my energy is fresh, because not doing that not only has an impact on me, but it has an impact on those who I help. And I think that realization is what then allowed me to give myself the permission, because if it was just for me, it didn't feel valid enough. But if it was for me and for the others that I'm helping, fine, I can take a bit of time off. So that was the realization that made me go, right, you do need to prioritize this. Yeah.
So putting your own life jacket on before you put on the life jacket of others.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. We are seeing a lot. I mean, you talked about the really long hours that you worked in, this intense 5-week period at the Olympics. We're seeing in the working world, in pretty much every industry, teachers work crazy hours. We see people in the corporate world working, such long hours, in the construction industry, in so many industries. What's the advice that you would give your clients in your MindForPerformance practice on how to avoid burnout?
Yeah. So again, I would say you need to plan in how you look after yourself. You can't leave it to chance that you're going to have time in a day to do a bit of exercise, or that you're going to get to bed at a decent time. So I always sort of look at how they prioritize sleep, because lack of sleep is just crippling, and you cannot manage yourself well if you are really, really tired. So how do you prioritize that sleep time? And it's then building good sleep hygiene, basically. So simple techniques like don't have your phone in your room, don't look at your phone or screens an hour before going to bed, set an alarm for the same time every single day. So simple things like that, but prioritize sleep and plan it, and then plan the other stuff as well. So plan where in your week you are going to go to have a run for 30 minutes. And it might not feel like it will probably never feel like you have time to go for a run, but actually with a bit of perspective, you definitely do have 30 minutes to go for a run. And doing that will actually allow you to work more efficiently that afternoon. But if you don't plan it in, it won't happen, because your mind will take over. That pressure of I need to do this will take over. So yeah, plan.
Yeah. And I think probably most of us can relate to, perhaps we've been working away. I'm thinking of a time when I was doing my master's degree, which wasn't that long ago. And I was working away on an assignment, and then I went for a walk, and all of the ideas suddenly hit me on that walk. I can actually nearly see myself. It must have been February, walking past daffodils and talking into my phone to a voice recorder as all of the ideas hit me. So I'm walking along, sharing the ideas. None of those ideas hit me when I was sat at my desk trying to write that assignment. So it can actually help us, if we take the time out to go for the walk or the run or whatever it is, it actually literally can be more productive in the moment, let alone in the long term.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Jess, usually at this stage in the interview, I go to the rapid fire round, but I mentioned to you that today's interview is a little bit different because I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined in the studio today by my own niece, who's also called Jess, and she's going to ask you the final question. So let's invite Jess in here. And through the magic of editing, I am now delighted to welcome my niece, Jess, who's going to ask a question to our wonderful guest, Jess. Jess to Jess.
What do you think needs to change to get more young women into sports-related careers?
Well, it's a brilliant question. I suppose ultimately, if we have more women in visible roles in sport, it makes it easier. It makes you young girls see that there is an option to go into that career path. And I think for more women to be in those positions in sport has to adapt slightly in how it does things to make it easier for women. So simple things like having more flexible working would be a good start. Another thing would be having better parental leave. So not just maternity pay, but also parental leave for a partner, because that makes it easier for a woman to go back to work. And I think that those two things, flexibility and good parental pay, don't often happen in sport because, one, they don't need to because there's not many women working there, but it is a barrier, and you see that women drop out of the workplace often in that elite sporting world. I think that ideally all jobs would be advertised. This is probably a controversial one, but sometimes you see that jobs in sport just don't get advertised at all, and therefore it's hard for women to even apply because those conversations happen behind closed doors in with their pals or ex-athletes or ex-players, for example. So it's really hard for women to get in the door, but actually if they were just given the opportunity to showcase what they can do, I think that you would see way more women getting jobs. And it is changing for the better, but it's taking time.
I found that a fascinating answer. And also, there's a famous phrase, you need to see it to be it. And looking at you in a sports adjacent role, which is just as important to get more women in sports adjacent roles. And thank you for being an incredible role model. I do think you have another question, do you, Jess? Yeah. Shall I give the microphone back?
Yeah. How do you think we could support our friends or teammates who are struggling with confidence, like on sports teams?
Again, it's another really good question. I think there's a lot actually that other people can do to support their teammates. And I think first and foremost is just sort of asking them how they're doing and how they're finding it. And when they say, do you know what, actually it's really quite hard, to be like, yeah, I get it. I'm finding it hard too, and sort of normalize it for them. But just by asking the question and showing you're supporting them side by side, they're already not going to feel totally alone. And even small things like if they've, I don't know, missed a goal in football, for example, going up to them and saying, oh, that was really brilliant that you tried that. It didn't work this time, but I know that you've got it next time. Keep going. So giving that positive feedback and reassurance that it's not expected that you're always going to score a goal, for example. I think small things like that can have quite a big impact.
Well, thank you both so much. I have to say I've really enjoyed this interview, and I'm positive our listeners will too. So Jess, thank you for joining me for Work Experience. I've really appreciated your support. And Jess Thom, thank you for the incredible work you do and for taking your time to share all of those important insights with us here at the Working on Wellbeing podcast.
No problem. Thank you for having me.